Hello and welcome to this video tutorial brought to you by tastytuts.com. In this video, I'm going to introduce you to 3D in Adobe Photoshop. Now this video is for viewers who have not used 3D before, so if you're new to 3D or have not used the 3D feature in Adobe Photoshop before, then you may find this video useful. In this tutorial, I will be covering quite a bit of ground. I'll be covering quite a few details, and I'm hoping that by the end of this video, you will have a clear understanding of how 3D works in Photoshop, and hopefully be confident to explore 3D in Photoshop yourself. So, if you only use Photoshop to edit photos and work with 2D graphics, you're going to find the 3D feature in Photoshop a whole new ballgame. When using the 3D features, you will sometimes feel like you're using an entirely different program. It's pretty amazing the tools Adobe have brought into Photoshop to enable you to create some pretty impressive 3D compositions without owning some of the high-end 3D programs like Cinema 4D, 3D Studio Max or Maya. Now the 3D feature was first introduced to Photoshop in CS5 Extended. For this tutorial, I'll be using Adobe Photoshop CC. So unfortunately, if you're using any version earlier than CS5 Extended, you will not be able to follow along. Now, if you do have CS5 Extended and above and wish to follow along with this video, you can download this example you see here. The link is in the description. So this video is an overview to 3D in Photoshop, so we are not going to be creating any 3D objects in this video. I'll be showing you how to create 3D objects in the next video. Now, we will be working in 3D in this tutorial, so you will be able to experiment and play around in 3D. If you watch this video, you will get a good foundation of knowledge, so when we move into the next video, you will be confident to start working with 3D. So get comfortable, we are going to be learning a lot here. So here we are in Adobe Photoshop CC, and this is an example I have prepared earlier. This is a simple 3D type composition, and we can see here we have some interesting materials, colors, and some nice shadow effects. Now all these light, shadow, and color effects were generated using the 3D tools. So the first thing I'm going to do is close this document down. If you have already downloaded this example, don't open it just yet. Now, to best prepare us to use 3D in Photoshop, we need to be able to see two panels in particular. We need the 3D panel and the Properties panel. Now if you don't see your 3D and Properties panel, you can come to Window, scroll down and activate the 3D and the Properties panel there. Now for the sake of this video, I'm going to click and drag my 3D panel and my Properties panel out like so we can clearly see them. And I'm going to stack them like this, so my Properties panel is on the top and my 3D panel is on the bottom. So once you can see your panels, it's time to open up the example document. So once you have the document open, let's take a look in the Layers panel. Now currently you can see three folders here. We have a red, a yellow, and a violet folder. Now I have organized them in this way so you can clearly see what's going on. And I'll just toggle these down so you can see the contents. So the top folder is the text folder, and this contains ordinary text layers. Nothing 3D about these, just normal text layers. I'll just toggle this in like so. Now if we just jump to the bottom, we have the background group. This is a folder full of colored backgrounds, and we have a few to choose from here. And again, nothing 3D about these, so I'll just toggle these in. Now, if we look in the middle here at the 3D folder, inside we have a 3D layer called 3D text. Now we know this layer is 3D as it has a 3D symbol on it. Now if I press V on the keyboard to activate the selection tool and click on this layer, we will now activate the 3D mode, and we will now see some changes happening in our workspace environment. Now if we simply click onto another layer in our layers panel that is not 3D, we will then deactivate the 3D mode. If we click back on the 3D layer, making sure we have the selection tool active, we will then again activate the 3D mode. So keep this in mind. To navigate around a 3D layer and attempt to edit a 3D scene, we must click the 3D layer in the Layers panel with the Selection tool active. So now we have activated the 3D mode, we can see the properties and the 3D panel has come to life with various options. Now the 3D panel works very similar to the Layers panel, in which it contains all the 3D elements that make up the 3D scene in a stacked visual way. It's here we can clearly see, access and select various 3D objects and components that make up the 3D scene. For example, if we click on some of the 3D objects below, notice how they are being selected in the canvas area. Now we can also select these 3D shapes in the canvas area too. If we carefully come into the 3D scene in the canvas area and begin to move our mouse over the shapes, we can see Photoshop highlighting each shape with a faint black border. This is Photoshop telling us that these are indeed individual shapes. If I begin to click to select them, we will also see them highlighted in the 3D panel. So in a 3D scene, we can select an object either manually in a scene or in the 3D panel. Now to deselect a selected 3D object, we can simply click off the shape into the empty space around it, like so. Now, if we look closely on the top of the 3D panel, we can see 4 icons. Now these are simply filters in which we can access specific elements of our 3D scene. The first filter is Whole Scene. This will enable you to see everything in this panel. The next one is Filter by Meshes, and we can see here we have all the meshes in our scene. Now mesh simply means 3D object. Next we have Filter by Materials, and lastly we have Filter by Lights. For now, I'm going to click on the first one, Filter Whole Scene, so we can clearly see everything in the scene. So, what do we have in the 3D scene here? Well, taking a look in the 3D panel, starting from the bottom, we have some 3D objects, or meshes to be correct with the terminology. Moving up, we have 2 camera views. Now, if I click on the default camera view, we can see the camera changing in the canvas area. And if I click onto the tutorial view, this will change back. Moving up, we have 2 light sources in the scene, and as I click these, we will see them being activated in the canvas area. Moving up, we have the current view camera, scene, and environment. So, depending on which element you have selected in the 3D panel, this will trigger the respective options for this in the Properties panel above. For example, if I click on a 3D object in my scene, we will trigger the options for this shape in the Properties panel. Now it's here we can toggle and tweak various options that will change the nature of this 3D object. And just like in the 3D panel, we have some options at the top. Currently, we are looking at the mesh options. And here we can tweak some options. One in particular, here is the extrusion of our shape. Here we can easily change the depth of this. Now, it's important to mention that 3D layers are often generated from a layer or a text element. We have a button here called Edit Source. By clicking this button, we can open the original asset that created this 3D shape. And here we can see we have a box with the number 3 cut out. Now if I close this and select the word Introduction, come into the Properties panel and click the Edit Source. Here we can see that this is an ordinary text layer, which we can change. And if I save this, it will then change the 3D object in the scene. Though for now, I'm just going to close this and not save. Next, across we have the Deform options. And here we can do a range of things like twist and taper the extrusion on the 3D shape. Next, we have the Cap options. Now this will allow us to add a bevel to the face of our 3D object. For example, I'll click the word 2 here and zoom in. If I come into the Properties panel, I can add a bevel width percentage, and you can see that being applied to our 3D object. Now the last option is the Coordinates option. Now later, I'll be looking at how we can move objects around and rotate manually in the scene. Here, however, you can enter in values to place and rotate an object to specific coordinates. This option can be very useful. So you can see now how close these two panels, the 3D and the properties panels, work together. Now with the 3D mode active, we can now see this new window in the top left. This is our secondary 3D view window, and this is going to help us coordinate our 3D objects in the scene and look at our scene in various angles. For example, if we look in the top left here, we have a Select View Camera button. If I click this, I can select an alternative view to preview here in the window. In this instance, I will select Back, and here we can see the 3D composition from a different angle. Now, if we want to project this view into the canvas area, we can simply come over to the right here on this window and click this little button here. Now clicking this will swap the secondary and main camera view. So I'll click it once and we can see our 3D scene in the back view. And if I click it again, we will swap it back. Now at this point, you may be wondering, how can I still see these text layers here? Well, if we look in the Layers panel, we can see that these text elements exist in the top text folder, and these are not 3D elements. And we know this because we can not see any 3D icon applied. So on this occasion, I'm just going to toggle the visibility of this folder so we are no longer distracted by them. So back in the secondary window up here in the left, at any point I can close this window by clicking the cross in the top left corner. Now if I want to bring this back, I can simply come to View, scroll down to Show and click the 3D secondary view. So upon clicking and activating the 3D mode, we can now see some new tools appear up in the control panel. Now these are our 3D Move tools. We can use these move tools to not only move around and edit our 3D shapes in the scene, but also the camera. Now it's important to mention at this stage that a 3D scene does not only consist of 3D objects and lights, but also cameras. Now currently, I do not have any objects selected in the scene, and I can confirm this by clicking into the empty space around my objects and looking into the 3D panel. Now when you have no 3D objects selected in the scene, by default, you will have the current view camera selected in the 3D panel. This being the camera view we are currently looking at. Now we can use these move tools here in the control panel to alter the camera view. So I can use the first tool here, the rotate tool, to click in my scene area and rotate around my 3D scene like so. Notice that the mouse cursor also changes to the icon of the particular move tool to help indicate which tool I'm currently using. Now the next tool across is the roll tool, and I can use this to roll my camera view. Next we have the pan tool, and I can use this to pan my camera across my scene. Next we have the slide tool, and I can use that tool to slide the camera. And lastly, I have the zoom tool, and I can use this to zoom the camera in and out like so. So that is how you can alter the camera view in your scene. I suggest you have a little play around with this to get a good feel of these move tools. But now my camera view is completely off from my original view. Now if I come back to my 3D panel, here we will see a camera object called Tutorial View. Now if I select this, we will jump back to my original view. Now this is done easily because I previously saved this camera view. So let's, for example, quickly change the camera view using the move tools up in the control panel. Now, if you find a camera angle you like and want to save it to come back to it later, you can simply come down to the bottom left, and there is this square here with a diagram with 3 arrows. Now, if we right-click this, we can also change the camera view, but here we can also save the current camera view in the scene. I'll click Save and call this New View, and click OK. Now, if we look closely in the 3D panel, we can now see that we have the 3D view camera saved as an item in the panel. So if I click on Tutorial View, we will go back to the original view. And if I click on the new view, we will jump back to the view we just created. Pretty convenient. So, However you change your camera view going forward, we will always be able to come back to this one. So upon clicking and activating the 3D mode, we can now see what looks like a grid and a red and blue line in the background. Now the grid is representing the ground plane in our 3D scene. If we look carefully in the secondary view and make sure it's set to back, we can see the base of some of the 3D shapes in the scene are sitting on the baseline, and we have this one shape that is not. Now it's the baseline in this instance that is capturing the shadows emitted by the lights in my scene, and we can see these as I click off the 3D layer in the layers panel. I'll just click back onto the layer to activate the 3D mode. Now this baseline grid is here to set our 3D scene, and we will use this baseline to orient ourselves in the 3D space, align objects, create shadows, reflections, and give us perspective. Now the red and blue lines represent our X and Z axis. If you don't know what this is, I'll be explaining this very shortly. So that covers the initial workspace changes to be aware of when using 3D in Photoshop. Now we are going to get a little technical and look at how our 3D shapes work within our 3D scene here. So if I select this square object here with the 3 inside, we can see upon selection we have a grey bounding box around it, and also a widget appears in the middle with these 3 bars, one green, one red and one blue, pointing in 3 different directions. Now every time we click a 3D object in our scene, we are going to get this bounding box with this widget in the middle. So what is this widget that appears in the middle of each shape, and what does it do? So to help demonstrate this, I'm going to use a diagram. So when a 3D object exists in 3D space, it revolves around 3 access points: X, Y, and Z. Now it's important for you to familiarize yourself with these access points, as this will help you understand and manage your 3D elements. Okay, so how do these work? So here we have a 3D object in a scene, and we are looking at this from the front view, a 2-dimensional view, and we can see the baseline across the bottom. So on this object we have the X and the Y axis. Now the X axis allows us to move our 3D object left and right in the 3D scene, and the Y axis allows us to move 3D objects up and down. So the Y axis up and down, and the X axis left and right. Now if we take a look at another view here of the same 3D scene, but this time in a 3-dimensional view, this isometric view, here we can see more sides of our 3D object on our baseline at a different perspective. So here we have the X-axis and the Y-axis, and we just learned that these axes allow us to move the object up and down, and left and right in a 3D scene. But now we have a third access point, the Z-axis point. Now this allows us to bring the 3D objects forward and backwards in a 3D scene. So the Y-axis up and down, the X-axis left and right, and the Z-axis moves backwards and forwards. So to help you, I have prepared this reference sheet which you can find in the project folder, and you can download this in the description. You can spend more time looking at this and familiarizing yourself with the X, Y, and Z axis points. So back in my example document here, if we click to select various shapes in the 3D scene, we can see the widget appear in the middle of the shape with the access points. Now we can use this widget to edit our object and reposition the object in the 3D scene. So I'm going to zoom in on the 3 block here and select it with the selection tool. Now if we move our mouse cursor over this widget very carefully, we can see various points become highlighted on the widget and the mouse cursor change. So let's start from the middle here. If we move our mouse cursor over the white box in the middle, we will see our mouse cursor change to what looks like arrows pointing out. Now if I click and drag out and in like so, I can easily change the scale of my 3D object, though I'll just undo that for now. Now if I move my mouse along the x-axis, we will hit another interactive tool. Now if I click and drag this, this will allow me to scale the object along the x-axis. Now this tool also exists on the y and z axis, so we can also scale our object on the y and the z axis. I'll just undo that again. So the next tool along the axis point is a rotation tool. Now as we place our mouse cursor over this tool, we will notice the yellow ring appear, demonstrating we are able to rotate. So I'll go ahead and click and rotate on the x-axis, the y-axis, and the z-axis. And now the shape has a new position in the 3D scene. And I'll just undo that. Now the last tool on the end of the axis point is the move tool. So depending on the orientation of your object in the 3D scene, you can click these and drag to move the object along that axis point. So I'll drag along the x-axis, the y-axis, and the z-axis. Easy. So that's how to use the axis widget to edit and move your 3D object around a 3D scene. Don't forget that if you click off the shape to deselect it, you will then be able to move the camera around your 3D scene to get a different view to move your 3D objects around. Once you get familiar with this widget and moving around the camera, you will be able to move lots of 3D objects around in a scene to get interesting layouts and compositions. Easy. Now, using the widget is not the only way to move and edit your 3D shapes. Now if we click to deselect, remember that we can use the move tools up in the control panel to move the camera. Now we can also use these tools to move our 3D objects around, but first the object must be selected. So I'll select my 3D object, and I'll know it's selected as we can see the widget in the middle. I will come up to the control panel and select the first move tool, the rotate tool. And if I place my mouse in the empty space near my shape, I will see the cursor represent my rotate icon. Now if I click and drag carefully, I will begin to rotate my shape freely in various directions. Now if I click the next tool across, the roll tool, I'll be able to roll my 3D shape also. With the pan tool, I'll be able to pan my shape. With the slide tool, I can slide my shape. And lastly, with the scale tool, I'll be able to scale my shape. Easy. And guess what? It does not end there. There is another way you can move and edit your 3D shapes. Now, with the shape selected, we should be able to see a bounding box Photoshop places around the space. Now, if you move your mouse cursor over specific points of this bounding box, you will notice the mouse cursor change to various move tools and a particular face become highlighted. For example, if we move the mouse cursor over the face, we can see an orange highlight, and the mouse cursor change. This will allow me to click and drag and move this shape up and down on the z-axis. If I carefully move my mouse over the side of the x-axis, I will notice that part become highlighted, and I can click and drag to move this back and forth on the x-axis. Now, if I carefully move my mouse cursor over the edge of my bounding box here, notice how just a little part is highlighted. This is telling me that if I click and drag here, I will be able to rotate on that access point. Next, if I move my mouse cursor up into the top corner of the bounding box, we can see a highlight in each corner. This will allow me to rotate around the z-axis. So, as you move your mouse cursor over various parts of the bounding box, you will be able to rotate and move along the various axes. So that's the many ways you can interact with your 3D objects in a scene and move them around. Next, I'm going to talk about materials. As you can see here in my final render, I have various colors and materials applied. So back in my example document, I'm going to select an object. And for this example, I'm going to select this letter D. Now, when you select a 3D object in the 3D scene, if we look in the 3D panel, we will notice it is selected here as well. So here we have the object D selected. Now here in 3D panel, we can toggle this object down. and this will show us the materials that make up this 3D object. Now, if we look carefully, we can see there are 5 materials that can be applied to this 3D object. We have the front inflation material, front bevel material, extrusion material, back bevel material, back inflation material. Now, to demonstrate these materials, I'm going to use another diagram. So this is a diagram to show basic 3D shapes with and without bevels. Now, on the left is an example of a 3D object without a bevel, and this one matches the materials I currently have applied to the letter D in my scene. Looking back in my 3D scene, we can see that one side is pink and the other is a dark blue. Now, every basic 3D shape in a scene has a front inflation material. Now, this is just basically the face of an object. In my case, it's a pink colour here and it's on the Z-axis. Every basic 3D shape in a scene also has an extrusion material. Now, this is basically the side of a 3D shape. In this example, it's a grey-blue colour. Now, this extrusion colour will wrap around the entire side of the shape, the entire extrusion material. Here we cannot see the bottom part on the other side, but that colour will still be the same. Also, every basic 3D shape will have a back inflation material. This is simply the opposite side of the front inflation material, and this can be a different colour from the front. Now, in Photoshop, we can also apply a bevel to a 3D shape. So this example to the right is the same shape as the one on the left, though this time we have a bevel. So the front inflation is the same, the extrusion material is the same, the back inflation material is the same, but here we now have some bevel colours. Now, in Photoshop, a bevel can be applied to both the front face and the back face separately, and a different colour can be applied. Here on the front face, we have a green bevel, and this is called the front bevel material. Now, if I come into my 3D scene here and select the D shape, we can currently see it has no bevel applied. So with this selected, I'm going to come to the Properties panel and select the Cap option. This will trigger the Cap widget on my 3D object. Now first, I need to select which side I want to apply my bevel to. At the top here, you can toggle between front, back, and front and back. On this occasion, I'm going to choose front and simply type in 40% in my bevel width option. Now we can see that this has applied a bevel to my 3D object to my letter D. So with the 3D object still selected, I'm going to come down to my 3D panel and look for the front bevel material on my D object. With that selected, we will notice the options change in the Properties window. I'm going to come up into the Properties panel and change the diffuse colour to a light green. And now you can see how that colour has been applied. We now have a green bevel applied to my pink face. But I'm going to undo that, as I do not want the bevel for my composition here. So that is how you can apply a bevel to the front of your 3D object. Now, as you can see here on this diagram, you also have a back bevel material. This can be applied in the same way as we just applied to the front, though you will first have to select back from the Properties panel first. So that's basic 3D object materials in Photoshop. If you wish to download this diagram to study it further, you can find this in the project folder. The link is in the description. Now, as you select your various materials in the 3D panel, you will also be able to choose from various material presets. If we look at my final render here, we can see we have this nice glass material applied to this block. So back in my example here, if we locate the 3 object in the panel, we can select the top material, press and hold Shift and select the bottom material. With them all selected, we can apply the same material. In this instance, I have this glass crystal material applied. It's at an opacity of 20%, and we have some reflection applied. So that's giving it a real interesting effect upon render. Now up here on the right, we can see other materials. If I click this little tab on the right, we can choose from a lot more presets, like so. Pretty cool. So next, I'm going to talk about lights. As you can see here in my final render, I have some nice shadows and interesting reflections going on in this 3 block. Now, all this was created by the material applied to the 3D shape and the lights in my 3D scene. So back in my example document, when we activate the 3D mode, we can see these white balls at the top of our canvas area. And if we look closely, we can see different icons are represented in each. Now if I select these with the selection tool, we can activate them. Now as I select them, you can see they are also being selected in the 3D panel. So as we select them, we can see that one is called an infinite light and one is called spotlight. And we can see that as we select them, they are demonstrating different widget toggles. Well, that is because these are 2 different kinds of lights. In Photoshop, you can use 3 types of light: infinite light, spotlight, and point. So the infinite light is like the sun, and this will cast light over the whole scene from a particular direction. If we select the infinite light, either on the 3D panel or in the 3D scene, we can toggle this if we click and drag the handle on the light widget. Notice how the shadows are now changing direction dynamically in the scene. Now the spotlight is slightly different. This is exactly what it is called, a spotlight. And we can use this light to focus and concentrate light on a particular part of the 3D scene. If I select this light in the 3D panel, we can see these rings, and that represents the intensity of the light. And I can click and drag on the handles to change the intensity, and we can see the shadows and light effects changing dynamically on the 3D scene. Now this light happens to be quite high up in my 3D scene. So on this occasion, I'm going to have to deselect my light to activate the camera and use the zoom camera up in the control panel to zoom out. Now we can see the spotlight and select it. And just like with the 3D object, here we have the X, Y, and Z axis widget, and this will enable us to move our spotlight in the 3D scene around the 3D objects. Easy! Now the last thing I'm going to cover is rendering your image. Once you have your composition exactly how you like it, you have your 3D objects situated where you want them, you have the materials how you like, the lights, and finally the camera position, you will want to render your image. To render your image, we can simply press the render button here at the bottom of the properties panel. But before you hit that render button, there are a few things you need to think through. Now you might think your composition is correct, but right now you are only looking at it in the 3D mode preview mode, which is represented by Photoshop. Now it's almost certain that the render will look a lot different to this preview when rendered. In Photoshop, a render can take anything from a few seconds to a few minutes, depending on the complexity of your composition and the speed of your CPU. Now, I have quite a powerful CPU here, and this composition took about 30 minutes to render. Now, you might not want to wait all that time to preview your render, so there's a nice little trick we can do here to help us. So, if you would like to preview a particular part of your 3D composition, we can come over to the menu and select the rectangular marquee tool. Now, if we make a small selection over a particular part of our 3D scene, and then come over to the render button and click that, Photoshop will only render what is in that selection. And after a few seconds or minutes, that will be rendered, and we can take a closer look. So that's a great technique if you wish to preview a small part, like a shadow effect or a material texture effect. If you are not happy with the effect, then you can simply toggle your camera view, light options, or material and keep previewing this way until you're happy, and then you can finally commit to the final render. So I'll bring back my text layers and hit the render button to render the entire 3D scene. So after my final render, I will have something that looks like this. Once your 3D scene is rendered, you will be able to make changes to elements of your artwork that are not 3D, such as changing the background color or editing non-3D text layers. Now you can save this document and it will keep your rendered state once you open it up again. However, if you make a change to the 3D scene, such as change the camera view, materials, or lights in any way, you will have to render your scene all over again. Though, if you close your document without saving and reopen, you will be able to retrieve your rendered state. So be careful. So that's an overview of 3D in Adobe Photoshop. In the next video, I will be demonstrating how we can create simple 3D shapes using text and shape layers. We will be working with materials and lights to create a simple composition. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video tutorial. If you liked the tutorial, hit the like button on my Facebook page. If you would like to see more videos like this in future, hit the subscribe button. Don't forget, you can download the documents you saw in this tutorial. All links are in the description. Well, that's it for another video, brought to you by tastytudes.com. Thanks for watching, have fun guys, and I'll see you next time.